King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, and elect of God. His Imperial Majesty, Haile Selassie I. These were the titles bestowed on Rastafarianism when he was crowned Emperor of the Ethiopian Empire on the 2nd of November 1930. As leader of a civilization that had lasted for over 3,000 years, the new emperor would now be seen by millions around the world as a universal symbol of African pride and sovereignty at a time when virtually all indigenous African kingdoms had fallen under European subjugation. And over the course of his 44-year reign as emperor, Haile Selassie would be many things to many people. To some, an imperialist and brutal despot. To others, a symbol of anti-imperialism and freedom. To some, an arrogant and selfish monarch, but to others, a literal messiah and God incarnate. Paradoxes and contradictions may be common to all major historical figures, but not many mixed oil and water quite like the last emperor of the Ethiopian Empire. There is a well-known Ethiopian folktale which tells of how Tafari's father, Ras Makonnen, governor of the Ethiopian province of Harar, was visited one day by a hermit who came to deliver a prophecy. Fighting alongside his cousin Emperor Menelik II, Makonnen had played a leading role at the famous Battle of Adwa, in which Ethiopian forces defeated Italy in a raging battle which would ultimately secure Ethiopia's status as one of only 2 African countries to have never been colonized. But despite his great military successes and political achievements, Makonnen was a man in crisis. His beloved wife had been having serious troubles with childbearing and had suffered a series of miscarriages. According to the folktale, however, Makonnen's troubles were finally resolved when the hermits delivered to him the following prophecy. This time, the child your wife is pregnant with will come into the world in the best of health and survive. He will grow up to be a fine boy, and when he is still a young man, he would rise to become ruler of Ethiopia and govern the whole country with a firm hand. He will bestow greatness and pride upon Ethiopia and make it renowned the world over. But ultimately, he will destroy everything he has built with his own hands and leave the country in ruins. As with many stories about the late emperor, whether or not the events described actually happened will forever remain a mystery. But putting aside questions of factual accuracy, the hermit's prophecy from this mystical origin story provides an almost perfect summary of the complicated life and legacy of one of the most consequential leaders in modern African history. Born to a noble family in eastern Ethiopia, Tafari Makonnen was surrounded by privilege and prestige from the very earliest years of his life. Through his mother's bloodline, Tafari laid claim to Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty, which according to traditional beliefs had ruled the empire from as far back as the year 980 BC. According to an ancient text known as the Kebra Nagast, which is translated as the Glory of Kings, the Solomonic dynasty began when Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, traveled from Ethiopia to visit Israel's King Solomon, the son of David. Although this famous meeting between the two monarchs is referenced in both the Old and New Testaments of the Christian Bible, the Kebra Nagast goes into more detail, telling of how the queen fell pregnant shortly after meeting King Solomon and subsequently gave birth to his son Menelik I, who ultimately became the first Solomonic emperor of Ethiopia. His privileged upbringing and noble blood notwithstanding, Tafari Makonnen's childhood was not necessarily an easy one. The early deaths of both his parents would see Tafari adopted by his father's cousin, Emperor Menelik II. Growing up in the corridors of power, the young Tafari would gain a first-rate education in power politics and develop a unique blend of charm and ruthlessness, which would ultimately see him rise to the very top of Ethiopian society. Standing at just over 5 foot tall, Tafari Makinen was noticeably shorter than most Ethiopian nobles, but what he lacked in physicality, he more than made up for in charisma and ambition. At just age 13, Tafari had been appointed titular governor of Salale, and by the age of 18, he assumed control of his late father's former province of Harar. And just 6 years later, at the tender age of 24, he became the most powerful man in Ethiopia in all but name when he was appointed as Ethiopia's imperial regent. But Tafari's rise to power would be just as much a result of good fortune as it was due to his political genius. You see, just around the same time as Tafari's coming of age, the ruling Emperor Menelik II had fallen seriously ill and was under pressure to choose a successor. Out of all the emperor's potential heirs, the only two reasonable options in his opinion were his grandson, Lige Iyasu, and his eldest daughter, Woizero Zauditu. In June 1908, Emperor Menelik suffered a severe stroke and, fearing impending death, announced Lige Iyasu as his chosen successor. But due to Iyasu's young age, the emperor requested that elder statesman Rastafarianism be appointed as regent plenipotentiary until Lige Iyasu was old enough to govern. However, not too long after his appointment as regent, Rastafarianism suddenly died after also suffering a stroke. Although Menelik was still alive at this point, he was now slowly drifting away on his deathbed. It was here that the young Lige Iyasu decided to seize his opportunity. Defying senior members of the imperial court, Lige Iyasu refused to share power or agreed to the appointment of a new regent. And so at just 14 years of age, Iyasu became the empire's de facto ruler. For obvious reasons, Iyasu's power grab would prove to be very unpopular amongst Ethiopia's power brokers. Working to ensure that he was not officially crowned emperor while they plotted his demise, senior members of the royal court would even refuse to announce Emperor Menelik's death for a full 3 years after his demise in 1913. Iyasu's enemies would finally succeed in bringing him down when in 1916 he was accused and tried for the crimes of treason and apostasy. Following a vindictive campaign led by the Minister of War, Iyasu was found guilty of converting to Islam and he was banished from the palace before being officially deposed. His aunt, Woizero Zauditu, was then named empress in September 1916, with Tafari Makinen appointed as a regent and heir to the throne. What followed would be 14 years of strife, political maneuvering, and bloodshed, in which Iyasu loyalists would unsuccessfully attempt to regain the throne, and a fallout between the more progressive Rastafari and the traditionalist Empress Zauditu would result in a failed attempt to overthrow Tafari as regent. But after all was said and done and the dust settled, Tafari Makinen ultimately emerged victorious. His campaign for ultimate power began with him forcing the Empress Zauditu to crown him king in October 1928, and following Empress Zauditu's sudden death 2 years later, Tafari was finally crowned the Negusa Negast, meaning the King of Kings of the Ethiopian Empire. And from his coronation onwards, Tafari would now be addressed as His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I. But unbeknown to the newly crowned emperor, news of his coronation would quickly see him become the central figure of a new religion birthed on a land far, far away from the boundaries of his kingdom. On a small British colony, where black bodies had long been subject to scorn, ridicule, and subjugation, the news of Selassie's coronation would now be seen by thousands of black Jamaicans as a sign that the day of salvation was at hand. With a Bible in one hand, and in the other, a copy of the iconic June 1931 issue of National Geographic magazine, preachers of a new religion known as Rastafarianism began proclaiming a new gospel. According to them, Selassie's coronation was the fulfillment of a prophecy by the Pan-African activist Marcus Garvey, who famously encouraged his supporters to look to Africa, where a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is near. Despite facing strong resistance from the British colonial authorities, the new movement quickly began to grow under the leadership of his leading preacher, Leonard Howell. Defying the local authorities, Howell began proclaiming Haile Selassie as God in the flesh and urged his fellow black Jamaicans to no longer see themselves as British subjects but as Ethiopians. Howell would also claim that the emperor was arranging ships to repatriate all willing Jamaicans to the promised land of Ethiopia. Around 5,000 coronation photographs of the emperor would be reportedly reprinted and distributed amongst his followers for use as travel passports in anticipation of their redemptive journey to the land they now dreamingly refer to as Zion. But in sharp contrast to the Rastafarian vision of Ethiopia as an African paradise governed by a benevolent African messiah, the daily life of the average Ethiopian living under Emperor Haile Selassie's rule was hardly enviable. Despite its rich history and status as one of the oldest Christian civilizations in the world, Selassie's Ethiopia was far behind its European and Asian peers in terms of technological and economic progress. Like most ancient monarchies, Ethiopia under Haile Selassie's rule was essentially a feudal society in which an elite minority composed of monarchs, noblemen, and clergy exerted almost absolute dominance over a large peasant population who were kept in line through a combination of force and tradition. Despite several attempts to ban the practice, slavery was still common in many parts of the country, with an estimated 2 million people believed to have been in some form of forced servitude as at the time of Haile Selassie's coronation in 1930. Social mobility was more or less non-existent, and with the exception of the country's capital of Addis Ababa, modern innovations like electricity, road networks, and telephone lines were virtually unheard of. But perhaps the most pervasive of all of Ethiopia's structural issues was the way in which the concentration of all power and wealth in the hands of its noble families basically meant that the never-ending dramas and eternal squabbles between the empire's numerous princes, noblemen, and clergy often had very severe ramifications on the day-to-day life of the average Ethiopian subject. Although the generally low standard of living of the vast majority of Ethiopians living under Selassie's rule did not negatively affect the growth of the Rastafarian movement, the biggest test of faith for his most ardent believers would come in the year 1935, when Selassie would be forced to flee his kingdom following a violent invasion by the fascist Italian dictator Benito Mussolini.
Fox Movie Tone brings you the world's news. Lowell Thomas speaking.
Rome. In a blazing radio address, Mussolini proclaims his decision, war. Despite the League of Nations, Italy will conquer Ethiopia. Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie protests to the League that the Italians have already invaded Ethiopia. So the Emperor orders complete mobilization. He marshals his hosts of fighting men to defend his frontiers. The Emperor broadcasts an impassioned plea to the outside world to save Ethiopia from Italian conquest. The President of the Ethiopian Parliament speaks, and an American radio man introduces the Emperor especially to America.
Hello, America. This is Addis Ababa.
He defends his country's cause, calls upon the world to stop the war, and declares that Ethiopia is firmly for peace.
Le peuple éthiopien est fermement attaché à la paix, mais il est en même temps...
A nation praying for peace but ready to fight to the last. Rome deciding war. The League of Nations preparing to impose penalties. The clash of arms, the thunders of battle seem more terrifying, as at the radio station of Addis Ababa, the Emperor Haile Selassie pleads for peace.
Il assiste dans leur effort.
You see, while other African kingdoms were falling under the control of various European powers, Selassie had worked hard to secure his nation's sovereignty by making sure Ethiopia became a sovereign member of the League of Nations. Ethiopia's entry into the world's first intergovernmental organization was particularly opposed by Italy, who had long seen Ethiopia as the perfect addition to its sphere of influence in East Africa. Completely disregarding the non-aggression principles agreed by all League of Nations member states, Benito Mussolini's forces embarked on a brutal campaign to take control of Ethiopia and exert revenge for Italy's famous defeat at the 1896 Battle of Adwa. Despite giving an iconic speech in June 1936 at the League of Nations Geneva headquarters, in which he admonished member states for their idleness in the face of Mussolini's aggression, Selassie would be ultimately forced to flee his country when it became clear that there was no stopping the Italian advance. Just 5 years after his glorious coronation, Ethiopia's King of Kings had found himself under the protection of the British Crown in the small English city of Bath, where he was forced to take refuge. A long way away from the luxuries of his imperial palace, the emperor reportedly became so destitute that even the local bookshop refused to extend his credit. The very same man believed to be the African Messiah had been driven out of Africa by one European power and was now only being kept alive thanks to the goodwill of another. Selassie's expulsion from Ethiopia would even see him being branded as a coward by his forerunner, Marcus Mosiah Garvey. But even at this his lowest point, Selassie continued to maintain the support of many others within the African diaspora as the Italian invasion of Ethiopia triggered an overwhelming outpouring of support for the emperor and his nation all around the Caribbean islands and the United States. Salvation eventually came in 1941 when the Italians were driven out of Ethiopia by British forces fighting alongside members of the Ethiopian resistance during the Allied powers' World War II East Africa campaign. Notwithstanding the massive helping hand he received from the Allied powers, Selassie's return to Ethiopia would reinvigorate beliefs about his divinity and, more importantly, build his image as a symbol of African resistance amongst many within the various Pan-African and anti-imperialist movements that had just begun growing at the time.
It is good that you are here to record this picture of me in my palace garden at Addis Ababa. People who see this throughout the world will realize that even in the 20th century, with faith, courage, and a just cause, David will still beat Goliath.
Taking full advantage of his increased popularity in the years that followed his return, Haile Selassie began working to continue the great modernization drive which had begun under the reign of Emperor Menelik II. in addition to general improvements to the country's legal system, most notably in relation to the enforcement of anti-slavery laws and the taxation of the wealthy. Selassie's government would embark on a mass education campaign which would see over 200 school buildings erected between 1942 and 1952, as well as the establishment of Ethiopia's first university. Ethiopia's most talented young people were also encouraged and sponsored by the government to study abroad in the hope that they would one day return to put their new learnings to developing their homeland. Building his image across the continent, Selassie became a major supporter of the various Pan-African and anti-colonial movements that began during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Alongside the likes of Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, Selassie played a key role in the formation of the Organization of African Unity and offered his country's capital as the seat of the organization's headquarters. But in sharp contrast to the love and respect Selassie received within the wider African community, Selassie would be a man despised by many factions within his own kingdom. His move to forcefully homogenize Ethiopia by elevating his native Amhara culture and language into all areas of the country's religious and civic life would cause him to be hated by large numbers of Ethiopia's non-Amhara tribes and ethnicities. Following a famine in the Tigray province of northern Ethiopia in 1958, the emperor was accused of causing the death of over 100,000 people when he allegedly refused to send enough emergency food aid. But even in the parts of the country that had not suffered famines, most of Selassie's subjects continued to live in poverty as landless peasants under the oppressive hand of wealthy feudal lords and appointed rulers. But rather ironically, it was the emperor himself that would be the architect of the revolutionary end of the 3,000-year-old status quo. You see, Selassie's push to modernize Ethiopia by encouraging higher education and sending significant numbers of Ethiopia's future leaders to study abroad would ultimately result in the emergence of a new class of educated and progressive students, politicians, and military leaders who by the late 1950s had become very dissatisfied with the pace of change. With many African countries pushing to become independent democratic states, the idea that a country as large as Ethiopia could continue as an absolute imperial monarchy was simply unacceptable to many within Ethiopia's emerging intellectual class. The first major political earthquake to hit the emperor's throne would arrive in 1960 when a conspiracy led by one of Selassie's regional governors and the commander of his imperial guard resulted in an attempt to overthrow Selassie and convert Ethiopia into a constitutional monarchy led by the crown prince. Although the generally poor state of the economy and the desire for democracy amongst Ethiopia's educated classes meant that there was some level of popular support for the coup, the overthrow was ultimately unsuccessful thanks to some swift actions taken by Selassie loyalists. Despite its failure, the 1960 coup would frighten even Selassie's strongest supporters, and some of those who were brave enough to face him began calling for Selassie to consider democratic reforms. But whether by willful ignorance or genuine imperception, the emperor proved unable to see the writing on the wall, as his immediate response was to simply punish the coup plotters and move to consolidate his personal power even further. Adding fuel to the fire, the emperor soon made more domestic enemies when he entered into a violent conflict with Eritrean freedom fighters from across his northern border. This long-standing dispute began when nationalists from the land of Eritrea, which had been federated to Ethiopia by the United Nations back in 1952, began violently agitating for their independence from Ethiopia. In response to Eritrea's demand for independence, the emperor swiftly dissolved the UN-created Federation of Ethiopia and Eritrea and annexed Eritrea as part of Ethiopia. The irony and hypocrisy of an anti-imperialist icon forcefully annexing a smaller country may have been completely ignored by Selassie's global audience, but the violent 29-year armed struggle that followed would forever taint Selassie's image in the eyes of millions of his subjects. dealing with an almost relentless wave of pressures, from calls for greater democracy from domestic groups to the outbreak of a violent war on his northern border. The emperor grew increasingly old and frail in his appearance. But nevertheless, he continued to show no real interest in decentralizing power or taking a step back from his duties. Selassie's reputation as an African elder statesman and respected leader on the international stage continued to grow from strength to strength, almost in tandem with his increasingly precarious position at home. From front row seats at historic events such as the funerals of America's JF Kennedy and Francis Charles de Gaulle, as well as Shah Reza Pahlavi's infamous 25,000-year celebration of the Persian Empire, to state visits to newly independent African nations, peacekeeping conferences, and development aid fundraising events, the emperor functioned almost as a one-man government. With his image plastered across Western newspapers and his generally positive reception on state visits to Western countries, Selassie became a source of pride to millions around Africa and the Caribbean, who were simply not used to seeing an African leader command such levels of media interest and respect from other world leaders. Despite never expressly laying claim to the divine status conferred on him by the Rastafarians, Haile Selassie would make very minimal efforts to dispel the myths about his person. On the 21st of April 1966, the emperor even made an official state visit to Jamaica, where he met with key leaders of the Rastafarian movement. Selassie's visit to Jamaica would bring the country's capital to a standstill and birth even more folklore about the emperor. According to some accounts, Selassie is said to have wept as he descended from the plane and saw the surging multitudes awaiting him. In the midst of the general pandemonium were cries of people wanting to touch the hem of his garments and others pleading that he might prepare a place for them in his kingdom. Amongst those in the crowd was a certain Alfarita Anderson, who famously claimed to have looked at Selassie's wrists and seen the holes where the nails had pierced Christ during the crucifixion. Upon returning home and recounting the story to a lover Robert, she would inadvertently convert the man who would go on to become the greatest evangelist of the Rastafarian faith.
You know, a lot of people are confused about what a Rasta really is and have a very negative image of the Rasta. Tell us what a Rasta is.
See, Christ promised that he will return within 2,000 years, you know, and him say when him come, he will be the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the conquering Lion of Judah, through the lineage of King Solomon and King David. Now, my life have great meaning to me. So I really search to find out if God is here. When I search, I looking at Ethiopia. I look all about, looking at Germany, you know, because I'm not prejudiced. I look for God. I'm looking at Ethiopia, I see one man stand up with these names. Emperor Haile Selassie, name King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of Judah, through the lineage of King Solomon and King David, written in the Bible. One of my things is that the Bible, them say that King James edited the Bible. Now, my understanding is that if King James edited the Bible, I don't think he will edit it for the benefit of black people. So when the revelation turned out that Haile Selassie is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, coming straight through the lineage of King Solomon and King David, then, you know, we really know that this is a Christ return. Because we know in this world, yeah, when the white man edit it, he wouldn't edit it in our behalf. You know, he would have more edited to make it look like England going to be the big thing. But in the last days, they'll prove out that is Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, you know, and Haile Selassie's name is Rasta, So we are called Rastas, you know, called by his name.
Uh-huh.
And then it's a lot of things. We go as far as saying, him say when him return and you call upon him. Now this is God. Him say when him return and you call upon him, your mother and your father will forsake you. No.
By the start of the 1970s, Selassie had become nothing short of a fully fledged deity to millions around the world as his international profile continued to grow and the rise of Bob Marley as the world's most famous Rastafarian embedded Selassie's name into pop culture. But just as Selassie's star was reaching full brightness on the world stage, the sun would begin to set on his kingdom. Selassie's poor record on human rights, economic progress, and civil liberties would create a wellspring of grievances for Ethiopia's emerging generation. In his bid to quash various rebellions and maintain power, imprisonments and torture of political prisoners became regular occurrences in many parts of the empire. The Imperial Ethiopian Army would be particularly despised in the Eritrean countryside, where they allegedly committed several atrocities in their numerous skirmishes with Eritrean freedom fighters. But for all the many grievances Selassie's enemies had against him, the final nail in the imperial coffin would not come until the year 1972, when the breakout of a devastating famine in the northeastern province of Wollo led to the death of an estimated 40,000 to 80,000 Ethiopians. In the very same year where thousands were at risk of starvation, the emperor celebrated his 80th birthday in a lavish party which reportedly cost the government over $35 million, which in today's money would amount to over $220 million. The Wollo famine and its image in the media severely undermined Selassie's government's popular support, and the reverence and personal prestige of the emperor was irredeemably devastated. Fearing an impending overthrow, members of the emperor's inner circle even began pleading for him to step down before it was too late. According to some accounts, one of his closest loyalists, Ras Kassa Asarate, came to the palace and threw himself at the emperor's feet, begging for him to abdicate the throne. Although seriously moved by the gesture, the emperor is believed to have responded saying, "Tell me, did King David abdicate? We shall reign as long as the Almighty allows us." Against this general backdrop of dissatisfaction and disapproval of the emperor, a group of radical left-wing army officers who had long been waiting for the perfect opportunity quickly stepped up to overthrow the emperor's regime in September 1974. In one fell swoop, over 3,000 years of Ethiopian history and tradition was brutally crushed by the jackboots of a ragtag committee of Soviet-inspired soldiers known as the Derg. In the year following his overthrow, newspaper outlets would begin reporting that Haile Selassie had died under mysterious circumstances, but no one could say where his body was buried. For the Rastafarians, the fact that Selassie's body could not be found was evidence that their Messiah was forever living. Nearly 20 years after his reported death, however, a judicial investigation would uncover several signed documents detailing high-level orders from senior members of the Derg mandating the assassination of Selassie for the crime of leading a feudal regime. A man surrounded by myth and mystery from cradle to grave, Haile Selassie was undoubtedly one of the great enigmas of the 20th century. Never in the empire's over 3,000-year history did an Ethiopian emperor hold as much power and influence as Haile Selassie I. But rather ironically, it was this very fact that sealed his fate as the last in his lineage. But before any attempts to pass judgment on Selassie's time as emperor, it is perhaps useful to bear in mind the old adage, which states that the greatness of a leader only becomes clear in the light of the regime and rulers that come after him. Selassie may be rightfully denounced for his many mistakes and authoritarian approach, but the 1974 Ethiopian revolution, which overthrew his imperial rule, would open the floodgates to an era of terror and lawlessness on a scale never before seen in the country's history. Like many other revolutions and uprisings before it, the Ethiopian revolution would ultimately ravage its own children. The political instability and infighting that followed the emperor's overthrow would see over 1 million Ethiopians lose their lives and an even larger number either displaced or plunged into absolute poverty. And so perhaps when future generations judge Selassie's 60-year reign as regent and emperor, they just might conclude that his services to his country carried more weight than the many great mistakes which he undoubtedly made. Once again, it's KB Taiwo for New Africa. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, then please like and share this video, and also consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/newafrica. Thanks again for all your support, and until next time.